welcome to Pay It Forward. Now I've had so many requests from all of you who have made up my little dachshund pattern, my little patchwork dachshund, to make up the pattern in a cat. So I've done that for you. I thought I'd better get on with that in a hurry. So I have, and here you go. She's all ready to go, and you will find your pattern, your free pattern templates, of course. They are in the description box below. Simply click on that link in there and you will find those there. Remember to set your printer, when you're going to print out your templates, set your printer to print at actual size in the settings. That way the printer won't resize or do anything funny with those pattern templates. We want them to be absolutely spot on. So what are we waiting for? Let's get sewing. So let's begin with materials and pieces we'll need to make our little cat here today. Now this one, if you've made I see that a lot of you have made my little dachshund and you're doing some incredible things with him. I'm thoroughly enjoying seeing all of your little colour combinations. This little cat is put together in almost exactly the same way as he is. So many have requested this little pattern, so I thought we'd go with it. Now as far as your colours go, the rules are, there ain't no rules. So you can choose any kind of colour combination, like a lot of you have already done with this little dachshund. It's amazing how they come up and they still keep that absolute, you know, easily identified that they're a little kitty or a little dog. So let's go ahead and be bold. Now is the time to be bold. So I'm going for some lovely marmalade and ginger colours. So lovely oranges and yellows. So you're going to start off. Now I've interfaced all of my fabrics for this project. I know that you probably get tired of me saying that, but everything does come up better. You find the fabrics are easier to work with in 3D because we are adding filling. So I guess that's the difference between normal dressmaking and soft sculpture sewing. We do need a little bit more stability. So I've got my favourite fusible woven cotton interfacing on the back there of those two pieces. So you've got your two head pieces, and then we're going to need our little legs, and you've got your front and back legs there. So we've got our little front legs here. I've already got them pinned together ready, and our little back legs there, and they can be all different colors. Then you need your little tail pieces, which we've got there. You're going to need your back pieces. Now when I made the little dachshund, I cut 9 strips for his back strips here, which makes him very long. On the kitty, she's got longer legs and longer tail, of course, so I'm actually taking one of those strips off her back, so she's a little shorter. Of course you could make her longer for a little draft stopper, or you can make her even shorter still. So I'm going for 8 this time. And you can see there that I've just got a selection of all of those lovely yellows and oranges and so on. But I mean, you don't have to colour theme. You can be absolutely random with your colours. You can see there, that's the kind of look I'm going for. So I've got 8 of those. You find a pattern template for those. And then you'll need a piece that's already interfaced and ready to cut your little base piece, your little belly piece from. So we don't cut that one out until we've got our top assembled. The reason for that is because you may be adding an extra piece, an extra strip, or taking a strip away. So just make sure you've got a piece that's going to accommodate that body there. So for our little face details with this one, we're keeping this all really simple because these little projects tend to look better if they're very animated and very simple. So as we have with this one, it's what makes this one stand out so much is it's just absolutely just bam, there it is, there's his little face. So we're going to do the same thing with our little cat here. So we've got our muzzle piece, which will just sit in there. I have cut that from felt, but of course you can use fabric, that's absolutely fine. We've got our 2 little eye pieces. Again, we're going for that very animated little look, and they will sit in there. Felt again. These all have heat and bond applied to the back. Then we've got our little nose piece. I'm going for one that's a little darker this time. Normally I make all my cat's noses pink, but I'm going to go for that rust. I think it works. And we've got some little ear inside pieces there, which I've cut from a nice, beautiful, cool pink. And we're also going to need something for our eyes. Now here is where we can make a few choices. You can go for, just as I did with the little dachshund, we can make him just that very cartoon sort of looking face. We're going to be stitching a little mouth line in there. So you can see that's a really obvious little kitty face. Or we can change it up just a little, and you can double up with your buttons to give him a little colour around that eye, and we can still get that animated look. Just allows you to add a little bit of colour. Of course you could do this with a little circle of felt as well, but if you've got the buttons, why not use them? And if you are going to double up on buttons, make sure that the button on the underneath has a little rim around it. That little centre button sits much better if it has. So you can see there, that's a way of adding colour. I'm not sure yet, so I'm thinking I will decide as his little face comes along, but I'm thinking I'm probably just going to be me and go with those little black eyes, but that's just a little tip. You're also going to need a button for joining his head onto his body from the underneath, so a nice big button, whatever you've got there. We also need a little disc cut from fabric with just your heat and bond on the back. That's for a reinforcement for the back of the head. We actually cut an opening through the back of the head and fill him. Makes it much easier for you all and eliminates the need for a ladder stitch on that head. So that one is just cut from just another scrap. It really won't be seen. It's sitting on the back of the head, so not a problem at all. So our first step is actually with this little piece. Let's move this section of his little face away, and we will first remove our backing paper. Now you can see there that I have drawn on, I hope you can see that, I've actually drawn on a little line ready. That's my cutting line. It's right in the center of my circle. It is 50 centimeters, sorry, it's 50 millimeters, not 50 centimeters, 50 millimeters or 2 inches, that slash there. Just draw that in previous to ironing it on, so then you're all set. So, and this one will just sit right in the center of the head. It really is. Just make sure it is exactly centered, and that will be fine. We press that one on, and then you take that one to the machine, and then I just sew a close little zigzags or even a satin stitch right the way around, just to settle that edge in place and stop it from fraying. And I do just a couple of straight stitches across these two ends here. Just, it's sort of like a buttonhole, just like you would for a buttonhole, just for a bit of extra strength, so that when we cut that little opening, it doesn't extend further. So you can go ahead and press that one on and sew that one in place with your zigzag stitch. So there I've got my little circle stitched into place, and you can also see that I've just cut open that little opening there. Got my little bar tack stitching there. So that one's all ready. We can pop that one aside. So now we're going to start work on the face. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove our backing paper, ready to press that one on into place. Now that one just sits, it's just 1 centimetre from the base here. So we just need room for our stitching, for our actual seam. So just about 1 centimetre, make sure it's nicely centered. That one will be pressed on with a hot iron and a protective cloth. And at the same time, we'll add our little ear pieces. Now they sit right up. Now we're going to be stitching across this line once our head is all stitched together. So you want to make sure that those little ear pieces are sitting high enough, but not high enough to interfere with our seam, which will be sewn around here also. And they sit on the lower side to give us that idea of that little ear curling over. So again, just removing your backing papers and pressing those into place. Now I don't go ahead and press on all of my pieces and then start working on them, whether I'm machining them or sewing them by hand. The reason for that is I do it piece by piece as I go, because as you're working on your project, you're buffing up edges and you're just causing wear and tear on them before you've sewn those edges down. So it's better to keep it all nice and crisp. Just take your time and do it just a couple of pieces at a time, and that preserves all of those, just the neatness and the sharpness of those edges. So we're going to press those on, and then we're going to come back and decide how we're going to stitch those in place. Once you have your little pieces pressed on, then you can decide how you're going to stitch them. Now, as usual with my projects, I usually do a balance of both. So I have just gone ahead, and you can see I've just stitched on the machine, just in a matching thread, just close to the edge of that little ear shape there, just because I like the real straight little stitch on those pieces. But now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew this little muzzle piece on with a blanket applique stitch. So it's entirely up to you. You could go ahead and you could sew that same little blanket applique, that same little machine stitch around this one here, and that would work just as well. I like the blanket applique on this piece. I'm going for an orange. I've got my extra strong thread here, which I'm using as an embroidery thread, and I'm going to be sewing just that tiny stitch. Now I'll put the link up there for the blanket applique stitch if you haven't sewn one before. We'll do a couple of stitches here. So I'm going to keep it really tiny. So I've come in from behind, I've got a single thread and a knot in the end. And so I'm just going to take my first little stitch. So I'm going through both layers and just making sure I'm catching the underneath layer. And I'm going to pull that through the loop. My needle comes through the loop every time. Pull that one in, and I've got my first little stitch. I'm just using this coordinating orange. Normally I would use an off-white around this piece, but I'm loving the oranges in this project, so I'm just going to go with that. So my second little stitch pulled in, and you can see that that's going to give us a lovely little edging. Make sure you're always catching a little bit of that underside. Keep your stitches nice and even, and the most important thing when you're sewing a blanket applique stitch is to, as you work, make sure you keep rotating your work so that all your stitches are going straight out from where you are, because if you don't rotate your work, you'll find you'll get a lean to those stitches. They'll be leaning around the corner. So go ahead and you can stitch that little section on using whichever method you prefer. Now once you have your little muzzle piece all stitched on there, you can go ahead and add your eye pieces. Now your eye pieces, you'll notice they're not a circle, they're actually an ellipse shape. So you want to make sure that you've got that little ellipse shape just angling out. You'll see they'll tuck in nicely there. Leave some space between your little eyes and your muzzle. And then your nose also gets pressed on. And watch your position of that nose, because remember that the overall look we're looking for with this little cat is that his little head is going to be down and we want him tucked in. So we want to indicate that that little nose is tucking under there. So we don't want to be sitting that nose up here. That just won't look right. We've got to sit that one down just that little bit lower. Make sure it's all very centered. Get those pressed on. Now, once they're all pressed on, you can go ahead and stitch around them in your preferred way. Now, again, I'm going to be sewing with a black thread, just as I have on this little dachshund. I'm going to be sewing those little eye circles in, because I really want to animate those little edges. But you could, of course, just stitch them on the machine. And with this little one, previously, I have stitched over my little kitty's noses, you can see, over that template. So you could go ahead and do that and cover that little template with your stitches. Or this time I'm actually just going to sew that same tiny little blanket applique stitch around the entire edge of that one. I have my little eye pieces and my little nose piece stitched on now, and now I can go ahead and I can mark in my little mouth section here. Now the easiest way to do that, I'm going to be stitching over these lines in black on the machine. You could do it by hand using a linked back stitch. I just find it's nice and neat and tidy on the machine. So I'm actually just taking my very fine marker, and right from the center of that little nose there, just draw a straight line, and it's just a 1/2 centimeter. So just straight down. Don't make it any longer than that, because little kitties don't have a long top lip. So just that little 1/2 centimetre. And then I find if you just take a small cotton reel, you might have something else circle like that, and you just drop it in at the side there, and you can just draw around that on each side and make sure that you just line it up and that it's the same on the other side, and then you get that perfect little sweet kitty smile. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to stitch over that little line I've made 2 times in black on my machine. And now that all of our stitching is done, we can go ahead and stitch our little eye buttons into place. And you can see I've decided to go with that little pop of green behind that little eye. Another thing you can do is if you're going to make this for a very young child, you don't want to use the buttons of course, but you could use safety eyes. And actually safety eyes come in all sorts of different colours, so that would work very well for this project, because you could get that lovely little burst of colour behind the eye there. So we will see how that goes once he's all filled out. So our next step is to add our back to our front headpieces, and of course we've got that little opening already made, so we don't have to worry about an opening. What we do have to make sure of is that all of our little edges are beautifully lined up. And you can use your clips or your pins, whatever you like, and you should have front and back markings in your center. I've got them there just because it helps you line it up on the front and the back, so you get everything nice and even. So clip all the way around or pin all the way around, and all we're going to do is, it's a 4mm seam allowance, and you actually are just going to stitch around the entire outside edge. I always do that 2 times for strength. And remember, when you're sewing around these little curves, be thinking of the little shape of your little kitty face. You want to keep everything nice and fluid and rounded when you're stitching. Now that I have my stitching done, if you've got picking shears, you can go around the outside of that little seam there and clip all those curves. If not, definitely just clip all your tightest curves with your little scissors and take the tips off of those ears. And next step is to turn that little head through that opening, and I like to do that using my forceps, and I will actually tuck those ears through first. Just a matter of pushing those through and taking those through that opening first. Same with the other one, we'll pull it all through and we will give it a press. I have that little head turned through now, and you can see there that I've just given the tops of those ears and the top of the head a little press, because now we need to just draw a line just across the base of that ear there, so you can see where the dip in the ear happens, and just at the base of the ear there. Just draw a little light line across there, and now we're going to take that one back to the machine, and in a matching thread we're just going to stitch 2 times right across that seam, and that's going to separate those ears from the rest of the head. It will keep them nice and flat, and then the rest of the head will be filled. It just gives us a little bit more dimension rather than stuffing the whole head and having big puffy ears, which won't look as realistic. So go ahead and stitch both of those little seams into place. I have my little ear sections stitched in now, so now we can go ahead and stuff our little head. Now if you're wanting to add whiskers, now would be the time to do it. I am Mrs. Tidy and I like everything neat, so I don't add whiskers, but you can. What I would do is I would find yourself a nice extra strong thread. I have it doubled and I have a big knot in the end. All you need to do is go in through that little opening at the back, bring your needle out in your little mouth section there, pull that one through, the little knot will hold your threads and you can snip them off as you go, re-knot your thread, do another one and another one, that's up to you. I just like it all clean and tidy, so we will just pop that one aside. And so my next step is to start to fill my little kitty's head, and I will do that, we're using polyester filling. And I will just use my forceps to tuck in there, and I fill out particularly the tops of those little ears and across the base here, and really make sure that that little line there is really filled out. And what I do, the best way to fill these little two-part heads is to go around the outside of the little head first. So you want to be filling out that outside shape, and once you've got that outside shape you can then keep adding in the center, but you really want to get into those corners first. See there that I'm starting to fill out that top of that head, and I will do the same around here. I will start working my way around. Filling, as I've said before, stuffing is something that you really have to do to get better at it. It's just a good excuse to make more projects, I think. Practice makes perfect with stuffing. You need to actually use the product to get to know what it likes to do, and you'll just get better as you go along. So you can see I'm just going to work that outside edge until I've got that lovely shape happening. Once I've got that all smooth, then I can just start tucking into the center, and until we've got that nice and firm, and like we have with our little dachshund here, his little head is quite firm there, and then we'll just be sewing up that back opening. So you can go ahead and fill that one up. So once you have your little head all filled out and you're happy with its little shape, little ears are sitting nicely, just flip him over, and we can use your wool felting needle here if you've got one. I use a wool felting needle that helps compact the fibres of that filling. You tuck all those little fibres in there and also angle it down so that we're really making sure that all of those fibres are keeping that little perimeter of that head pushed out nicely. Now we're just going to sew up that little opening there, and remember this opening won't be seen, so it does not have to be a fancy stitch. So I've got my extra strong thread on my needle, just a single strand. I'm going to just come in there at the bottom, and I'm going to sew just a very basic overcasting stitch, and I'm going to make my way across and just pull in those two edges together. It just saves you a ladder stitch on the head. You see, I'm just going to pull that in until those little edges meet up. So make sure your filling allows you enough room to do that. You can see I'm just going to pull that in, and I'm going to work my way across that opening, and then I will double back and go over my stitching the second time. So you can see that's just a neat little finish on that little opening there, and so we've got our little kitty head all ready, and we can pop him aside now because we can start work on our body. The first thing that I do is I make his little arms and legs and his little tail, because these the little arms and legs are incorporated into the seams of his body, so we need to have those made up. So you can see there that I've got those just pinned right sides together in my different fabrics, and what we're going to do with all of those pieces is we're just going to stitch our our 4mm seam allowance, and that is we're leaving these tops open because that's where we fill the legs, and we're going to stitch right around that little leg section. And I still like to sew those seams 2 times because when we're adding stuffing it just makes it a more secure seam. So I will do that with both of those front and rear legs right the way around, and also with my little tail piece we're going to leave the top curve open because we're going to fill through there and then we're going to blanket stitch that opening. So we're going to start just about the top of that curve there, going to stitch all the way around the same seam allowance up to there. Make sure you're back and forth on those start and finishes, and then we will turn them through and get them all ready. Now I have all of my little arms and legs. I've just turned these ones through, and my little tail, and it's just a matter of taking that one. Actually, before we do that, on these little foot pieces I don't actually use my pinking shears here. I don't want to compromise the end of those feet, but I do make just a little snip just between those toes there on each one, just so we can pull that through. And we just turn that one through easier with my forceps. Right the way through. We want to push those little toes right out. And get in there with our knitting needle. And just really make sure they're nicely pushed out there. And as always with all of our seams, we're going to roll them out all the way along. So we've got all of our little arms and legs and our little tail section. So now we just need to fill them, and that is just as simple as, again, forceps are best for this because you can really take your filling right down to the end and put it exactly where you want. So I just fill out those little toes first, nice and firm. And once I've got those all nicely packed, then I will continue to fill my little leg right up to about, I'd say probably 1.5 inches, perhaps about 3 or 4 centimeters from the end, because when we pop these little legs into our little body, we don't want any bulk there. We also want those little legs to be quite flexible on that join. So leave some room at the end, but fill up this whole section nice and firm, and that goes for all of them. So we'll fill all of those up, and your little tail section also fill that one right up, but this one a little higher about to the top there, and we're going to be closing that one with a blanket stitch. So I'm going to get those all stuffed nice and firm. Right, so all of my little limbs are now filled, and you can see with the little arms and legs that I've filled them up. Remember, keeping it soft at the end. And I've just taken that one to each of those to the machine, and I have just stitched across to close that end. We're going to be incorporating those ends into the seam, so they're all ready. And we have our little tail, which has also been nicely filled. Now the top of this one, we're actually going to blanket stitch that one closed. You can, like I have, dropped a little bit of clear craft glue in that top just to close that edge first. And then you can just trim those little edges to make sure you've got no fraying away there. And we're just going to blanket stitch. I'm using my pearl thread here because it's just a little bit thicker. And I'm going to just stitch that top curve. I've just got a knot in the end, and it's just a single thread. So a blanket stitch is very easy to do. If you haven't done one before, I'm going to pop the link up there for you for a video that I have made that shows you how to do it exactly. But you can see that I'm just taking my needle through both layers, and I'm bringing my needle out through the loop each time. And you can see that creates that little loop across the top there. And that's what gives us our nice little binding, which is why we're using this stitch here. Just through the loop every time. Keep your stitches nice and small, and of course keep them nice and even. And that will close that little opening nicely. So I'm just going to make my way right across the top there. Our little limbs and pieces are all finished now, so we can just pop them aside for now. And now we move on to making the top section of our little body. And we've got our little, grab our little dachshund here, and you can see, because they're made in the same way, that we've got our little strips going across that creates our body. So it's really a matter of working out the little layout that you want. And remember that your very first panel here at the front and your very last panel at the back don't really get seen too much. So make sure that you use your real hero fabrics. Use them through this center section, because this is a section that you really see. So your favorites, pop them in there. So it's just a matter of laying them out and working out how you want that to look across your little animal's back, and then we will stitch them together. Now remember that I said this time I'm using 8 pieces. This little one had 9. You can use as many as you like. We're going to cut that base piece out once we've stitched all these together. So all you need to do is work out your little layout and then go ahead and stitch with still with your 4mm seam allowance, and join up every little piece with right sides together until you have that whole straight strip. Make sure that you're careful to line them up and that you're back and forth when you stitch those. So I'm going to make up my little patchwork pattern piece. And this is my completed top panel with all my lovely colours. And so now I've taken that to my iron and I've pressed all those seams out open and flat. And now we can cut our little base piece. So I've got my fabric ready interfaced, and we're just going to pop that one on top. And I'm just going to go ahead and pin that one into place. And then I will just cut that pattern piece out. Make sure I've got it really nice and flat. I'll pin that one all down, and then I will just go around and cut out my base pattern piece, and I will leave them pinned together. And once I have my base piece cut out, I've just removed the top couple of pins, and you can see that I've gone ahead there and I've just stitched across just about a few centimetres, an inch from each end, with that close little zigzag stitch that I always do on my openings. This is where we're going to be filling our little cat through that top opening between the front legs, so it's largely hidden by the head. So I want that opening to stay nice and true and not fray away, so that little stitch will help me there. So my next step is to tuck my little front legs into that seam, and I like to stitch them in there first, and they're just going to sit just a little way from the corner. So what we have to remember is that we need to be able to sew this side seam down here without that little front leg interfering with it at all. So I'm just going to give myself just a little bit of room, and it's probably about 1.5 centimetres from that edge, because remember we need to leave enough room in the centre. So I'm going to go ahead and I will measure each side, and remember that it is right sides together, and we're tucking those little legs inwards and sandwiching them between those two layers. But for now we're just going to stitch it into place, because it's easier when we sew that seam if they're already on one side. And so now that I've got those little legs stitched onto one side there, it's much easier for me to sew our top seam. Now we are going to incorporate our little back legs as well, and you could just put those in now and sew right the way around the entire piece, leaving that opening. But I find it's much better to sew this seam in first and then our bottom legs into that seam, because then we can check and make sure that our little legs are well incorporated into that seam, and then we can go ahead and sew our side seams. It just makes it easier, and it's a lot easier to do it piece by piece than to be unpicking later if you didn't quite catch a little leg into that seam. So you can see there that I'm just going to line up those two top lines there, and I've got my little leg pieces extending just a little. I'm going to increase my seam allowance to about 5mm, closer to your 1/4 inch, and I will stitch. So I'll put my little pin in here. I want to leave that opening as large as I can in between those little legs. So I'm only giving myself just about 5mm this side of the little leg, and I'll do the same on this side, and we will stitch only to there. So we're going to stitch just straight across this side and this side, and I'll do that 2 times for strength, and make sure you're really back and forth on that little section there, because that's where we're going to be opening up and also pulling our little the rest of our little dog's body through. So I'm sorry, that's a cat's body, not a dog's body. I'm mixing up my animals. Okay, so now we can test. We've got those little edges flipped, and we can test that those little legs have been nicely incorporated into that seam. You can see that they have, and it's just better to be able to check. So now we're safe to go ahead and add our little rear legs. So we're going to do exactly the same thing with our little rear legs, and they are going to tuck in here. Now remember that your curves of your little rear legs are on the outside, so they get tucked in just like this, just in the same way, and you want to leave just a little space as we did before for those little legs to go in. So just repeat the process that we just did. We will stitch those ones on and then join together that seam, only this time we will meet up those edges and sew that entire seam straight across. And so now I've got my little back legs in, and again I'm able to pull that through and just check that they're nicely anchored, nothing that we've missed there, and I can just pop those, tuck those, all those little arms and legs in, and make sure they're well out of the way. And then all we need to do is sew up our side seams, and you can do that by clipping those edges together, lining them all up, and we're just sewing a simple rectangle, so it's not difficult, and we're not worrying about those little arms and legs now. We know they're safely in there. So it's really just, and I always do this one at a time too, because then I can still check that seam from the other side. So I will clip that all the way, make sure it's all pulled out. Now my little back legs, when you're sewing this seam, at the front I just sew absolutely straight to that corner when I turn that one through, but at the back end, if you like, if you get to this corner, you can just taper it in just a little. That's entirely up to you. It will be just as lovely if you go straight across, but if you want a little more shape to it, just taper it around as you go. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that one in place, and then I will do exactly the same with this side. And that is my little cat's body all sewn up, and you can see that I've just taken off those corners there with my scissors, and I've just slightly tapered on each corner. So now our next step is simply to reach into that opening, and we need to find those little back legs, and we will pull those through first. As we pull those through, of course the whole back end will pull through. A little bit of a juggle. Once you've got those through, the whole rest of that little body will follow on. There we go, it's like turning an octopus through with all those little arms and legs. So we get our knitting needle in there now, and you can push those corners right out and also nicely roll out those seams, as we always do. And then we are ready to add our filling. Now you can fill this one entirely with polyester filling. That's absolutely fine. I like to add some weight in there, and I will add some rice. So it depends on who you're making it for and what you're making it for. They do go perfectly fine just with the polyester filling. I like to do a combination of the two. And if you're making it for a child, of course, that will change things. You can also use, I'm using dry white rice. I live in a very dry area, so no sort of humidity here. If you are worried about the rice, you can always throw in a little silica packet. You find them in your shoe boxes and so on, and your clothing, keeps the moisture out. You can drop one of those in. I tend to collect them. Or you could use some fine aquarium gravel, or you can actually buy toy pellets if you want to go to that expense. So what I like to start with though is I will grab my longest forceps and I will start with the polyester filling, because then I can fill out those little bottom corners. And all that I'll do is just alternate with a little bit of rice, a little bit of filling, until I've got my little body just sitting the way that I want it. I like it to sit quite nice and floppy and flat on the bed. That's why I like a bit of weight to it. We'll grab our little dachshund here. You can see he's quite soft, but there's a fair bit of weight in him too, so I love the feel of that. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that one up and add my rice as I go, right up until that top opening. So now I have my little body all filled the way that I like it. It's still got some nice give in it, and I've really packed out this front section. It makes this sewing this ladder stitch closing much easier. Now I've taken my wool felting needle too, just to help tuck those fibres in and keep them out of my way. And I have my extra strong thread, and I'm going to close this opening with a ladder stitch. You may have seen me do this many times. I do have a video that shows you exactly how to do this stitch. I'm going to put that link up there for you. But I've just come in, I've done my first couple of stitches, I've got a knot in the end, started at the top here, and we just make our way down, back and forth each time, going into our, travelling down one side at a time with our stitches. My little kitty's trying to help. You're not helping, kitty. Thank you. I would normally have this positioned in a way that's very easy for me to sew, but it's a bit tricky to show you. Perhaps you put your arm over there, kitty. Okay. And you can see that I'm going to keep on pulling on those stitches as I go, and I'm going to be able to knit that little seam together. I'm just going to travel back and forwards, crossing over, taking a little stitch each time. My video shows you very up close and personal how to sew this stitch. It's an invisible stitch. Once it's done, you can see each time I'm just going to be pulling that one in, and make sure with every stitch that you do give it a little pull, encourage those edges together. You don't want to be sewing right down to the centre and then trying to pull all those stitches up, because it won't knit together well. It will naturally slacken off each time you cross over sides, but it will knit together properly in the end. So have a look at that video if you need some extra help, and just travel all the way down until you've got that little opening closed. So that has our opening nicely closed there, and now we can go ahead and start adding our final pieces. We're going to add our tail first of all. Now our little tail is actually tied on. I'm using my extra strong thread, so I've got my needle threaded up with 2 strands of my extra strong thread, and I have a button. I don't know if I said that at the beginning. We need a button to attach this little tail. It's going to be sitting right here. You can decide which way your tail turns, and I've made a little mark in the center. Now it sits on the second panel just above that seam line there. That's the best spot for it. So the way that we do this is we actually just dive in through our button, position our button on our little end of our tail, and we're going to go through, and we're going to dive in one side of our little mark here. I'm going to take up a nice bite, travel across, and we're going to come back in the other side of our little tail and pull that one through. And you can see there, that's how we're going to pop that one on. All we need to do is remove our needle, and we can make our first little knot. we really want to make sure that little tail is tied on really firm. So I'm simply going to knot that little button off about 3 or 4 times. And that has our little tail nicely attached, and we've still got all that lovely movement to be able to pose that little tail. And the last step is for us to add our head, and we add that in the same way with a button, only this time we're popping the button underneath. So we need this time 4 strands of our extra strong thread. So I've put 2 ends through my needle, and I'm using a doll needle this time just to be able to pass through that little body there. So I start with my button. So I've got my button ready. So we're going to be flipping our little cat over, and we're going to just be coming, we want to be coming at an angle. So we want to be pulling this little head in and on an angle up. So we're going to start right in the center there, and we do go through the button. You can put a mark there if you feel better about that. And again, we're only going to be using 2 of those holes, but we're going to start by going through our button. And I've already made my mark on the front panel, so on the first panel of your front, and right on the seam line there. So right close to that seam line. And I'm going to come out just one side of that little spot that I've made. A few goes. I want it just where I want it. I've kept my button on behind, don't lose that button. Come through, and then we've got our little kitty's head, which is going to be sitting in nicely here. So flip that head over, and right in the center of his head, and just at the top of that stitching line, that closing that we did earlier. So right in the center, and we're going to come one side of it, we're going to dive in, we're going to take a nice big bite, travel across, and remember, this is why we reinforced this, so it's nice and strong. We don't need to worry about that. So we've traveled across, and then we're going to dive in again, just the other side of our little mark. Flip him over. Got our button in place, and we're going to come out just the other side. And through our button again in the other hole. It's all a bit of a pulley system. It all comes together in the end. Hang on to your ends. Flip him over. Check that you've got your head position right. And also check that your threads aren't twisted. So everything's nice and straight. And then we just do exactly the same thing as we did with the tail, where we're going to knot off. So do your initial knot, because then you can really pull that in. You can see how that's really going to tuck in nicely. And you can check on your head position. Now at this stage, if you're not happy with the position of your little head, no problem, just pull it out and reposition it. It's just as simple as that. So once you're happy with how that little head is sitting and you've got it all pulled in nice and tight, you can really compress that down. And remember, as tight as you do it, it will loosen off over time. So really get it pulled in nice and tight, and we will do the same thing and knot that off at least 4 times. And that completes our little patchwork cat. And so I think I've probably satisfied all of the cat lovers and the dog lovers for a little while. So I've tried to keep it all even and balanced. So I don't prefer one to the other. And we do also have, of course, our little sleeping kitty as well. So if you love the patchwork and working in the fabric, check out my little duck's wand if you haven't already, and you can see that they are made in exactly the same way. I thought it was only fair to make up that little pattern as a kitty as well. So let me know if you've enjoyed it, and certainly stay tuned. But I think it's probably time for some elephants and giraffes now. What do you think? I think so. Thanks for joining me. Well, thank you all for sewing with me today. I hope you've enjoyed making Little Miss Cat. I hope I've evened the score now between the cats and the dogs. I think I have. But you know, I'm thinking lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, don't you think? I think it's time for some other animals. I've heard all of your requests and I am busy working on all of those. Sometimes you have to remember I've got to keep it all doable for everybody, so those patterns take some working out, but there's so many more to come. You can follow me on Instagram if you like, and so many of you are. Thank you so much. I love chatting to you all, and I love seeing the pictures that you're sending me of all of your finished creations, and they're absolutely inspiring to me. I'm so thrilled to hear from so many of you that you are trying projects that you thought you never would, because you've been introduced to new techniques that make it easy, and that makes me so happy. That's exactly why I do this. So that's very exciting for me. And you know, I am going to push your boundaries. So I am going to be trying to get you out of your comfort zone a little bit. There's going to be some new techniques coming up in patterns, and it's good for us to step forward and improve all of our skills. So if you're sending me photos, you can check them out. I will pin them on my Pinterest board that I've made just for you, and it is called You Made It, because you did, and you're doing an incredible job. And thank you so much. Very inspiring for me to see all of those beautiful creations on that board. Come along, check out Lisa Pay on Pinterest, look for that board and join our little very positive community. So if you haven't subscribed, please do so. I would hate for you to miss the free patterns. They are always free. They are always going to be free, and there are many more to come. So let's look forward to many more projects together. So thank you all for all of your support, and remember, most of all those good things that come to you in your day, make sure that you share them. Make sure that you pay them forward. And until next time, it's a Uru from me.